The Mystery of the Pirate's Treasure, Chapter 2, The Dock Street Theater. After lunch, Mrs. Kramer asked Nicole to show Mike and Chris around the theater. "It's really quite fascinating," she said in her dramatic way, "that we're on the site of one of the oldest playhouses in America." She smiled, her witch-like yet enchanting smile that ended up at the corners of her large eyes. "In fact, you might even catch a tour." Chris wasn't too keen on having this sophisticated girl show him around, but after being cooped up for hours in the car, he was most assuredly ready to get out and do something. "How long have you lived in Charleston?" he asked when they were out in the hallway that ran the length of the old theater. "Almost a year now," Nicole answered. "We lived in New York before then." "Do you act in plays?" Mike asked, and Chris got a stupid look ready for him. On second thought, he changed his mind. Maybe Mike was doing what Mom said, taking his turn being nice to this girl. "When there's a suitable part," Nicole answered. Her diction was clear and precise. Diction means the way someone's speaking. Chris never had much use for girls, even when they were tomboys, and now, as they started down the broad stairs of the old theater, he just didn't know whether he would be able to put up with this prissy one for 2 whole weeks. "And this," a woman's high-pitched voice floated to them from another room, "is the recruiting officer, a painting of the first play ever given here and performed again after the restoration of the theater in 1937. Chris and Mike followed as Nicole led them into the dim room where the voice was. A small group of people stood listening before a painting of a gowned Southern lady and 2 gentlemen of a former day. Immediately, Chris recognized that they had, as Mrs. Kramer said, caught a tour. This was the auditorium, and the guide was telling some tourists all about the old theater. "This play," she said, pointing to a large painting on the far wall, "was considered so risque that every lady was given a fan to blush behind." There was a twitter of amusement as she continued. "You remember 18th century Charleston was much like old England in tastes and pastimes. Like the people of London, the inhabitants of Charleston had a passion for the theater. So," the guide seemed to be cutting a long story short, "the gaiety of the theater, balls, concerts, and assemblies continued until 1787. This was just following the Revolution with its many hardships, and the legislature of South Carolina ordered all entertainment on the stage stopped." "Do you mean it stayed closed until 1937? asked a stout lady with a black notebook. "Oh, no. For the first time," the sober guide smiled, "the legislature removed the prohibition by 1791, when things began to look prosperous again. Then, too, George Washington was coming to Charleston, and he did like festive occasions." This time she gave a broad smile that did not seem to match her voice. Chris surveyed the crowd. Mike hung on to every word the guide said. Nicole stood slightly back from the others, still looking nonchalant. History had never held much interest for Chris, and now he decided he'd had about enough for one day. Anyway, the gloomy atmosphere of the musty old theater with its railed balconies seemed to be having a peculiar effect on him. Something his mom had said on the way down about the spell the old theater had cast on her lurked in the back of his mind. Chris looked about him for the nearest exit as the guide said, "Now, note the wainscoted walls. They're 3 feet thick, and these gorgeous chandeliers that you see were once candles. Now they're electrified." All the time she spoke, her hands moved mechanically to point out various styles of woodwork, the native black cypress paneling and the Hanoverian arms of Britain over the proscenium. Chris was already moving toward the many French doors that opened onto a cobblestoned courtyard where the group was steered in that direction. "Now, in summer," she continued in her sing-songy voice, "the spectators might come out onto this patio for a breath of fresh air." Chris darted out onto the open courtyard ahead of the others and began to survey the moss-laden enclosure. Oleander and loquat bushes hugged the brick walls. There was no way, he observed, to get out except back through the theater, unless, of course, you climbed one of the large Carolina cherry trees that grew against the high wall. But even this led only to the tiled roofs of the other buildings that adjoined the Dock Street Theater. "Hey, Chris," Mike called. "Come see this snake's head that's really a fountain." "Neat!" exclaimed Chris, running over toward Mike, but in another moment he was dashing down a narrow brick corridor he spied. Once there, he wound excitedly with the narrow maze until he came abruptly to a fancy iron gate that was padlocked against the outside street. Through the scrolled work of the gate, Chris could see their station wagon parked in front of the theater. It was still loaded with their suitcases and other paraphernalia. That just means other odd things. In the next moment, Chris was running back down the passageway and into the now vacant courtyard. Luckily, one of the French doors had been left open. Everyone had gone from the theater, and Chris wasn't eager to hang around in the depressing dimness. Heavy red velvet draperies added to the gloominess of this room and its great bench-like seats. Even the lobby was vacant as Chris darted through and up the broad stairs, taking 2 steps at a time. From a kind of hollow, the thin voice of the guide again reached his ears. Before Chris got very close to the tour group, he saw them standing in a tiny room with several steps leading down into it. He had joined them before he realized it was a pub. The guide pointed to a wall placard with the recipe for Planter's Punch. It was here, she said, that the wealthy planters would come in from their large plantations of rice, indigo, and cotton for a little relaxation. Mike was still all ears for what the lady was saying. Chris watched as Mike began his habit of opening and closing his mouth like a pump. Finally, though, Mike did get his word in edgewise. "That's a portcullis," he said, pointing over the bar to the lattice grill that could be raised or lowered. Everyone turned to look at Mike as the guide said, "It certainly is, young man." Why couldn't Mike keep his mouth shut, wondered Chris. In spite of Mom's belief that Mike's interest caused him to speak out, Chris felt he was just being a show-off, and he detested it. Mike was so small for his age that everyone was always astounded that so much knowledge could be tucked away in such a little fellow. Chris noticed that Nicole was still standing apart from the others, looking on in her superior manner. If Mike's blurting out affected her, she gave no indication of it. Looking about, Chris saw that one of the windows in the pub opened onto the tiled roof of the lower floor of the theater, and this led to the courtyard with the tall cherry trees. He'd remember that. And on the way back down, the guide continued, "Do look in on the reception room. The woodwork there is superb." This guide is going to go on forever, Chris thought. More than anything, he wanted to do a little exploring on his own. "Nicole," Chris called softly as he motioned to her and Mike to pull away from the group. "What's down that way?" Chris pointed to the hallway running the opposite way from the Kramer's apartment. "Oh, the furnished apartment you'll stay in and the prop room," said the poised figure. "That's a pretty far away from the stage for a prop room, isn't it?" observed Mike. "Actually," Nicole spoke with careful articulation, "it is, but nobody would ever live in that room." "Why not?" asked Chris. Nicole hesitated, lifted her head in her stage-like manner, and then spoke. "Because one night, a long time ago, an actor by the name of Junius Booth tried to murder his manager, Mr. Flynn, in there. He beat him over the head with a cast-iron fire dog." "Golly," said Chris, and although he could see Mike wanting to get his word in, he kept going. "You mean that kept people from wanting to stay in the room?" "Yes," said Nicole, unaware of the meaning of Michael's pumping signal. "It did. The servants were the first to say they could still hear Mr. Flynn crying out during the night, and word passed down so nobody would ever sleep in there. That's why it's used as a prop room. Really a storage place for old junk that's been there for just ages." "Can we go in?" Chris asked, still ignoring Mike's cue to speak. "I suppose so," said Nicole in her nonchalant way, "but it's awfully dirty and dusty. None of the servants will clean in there either." "You mean it isn't locked?" Chris asked, incredibly surprised, as Nicole reached to turn the old knob that was loose in its socket. "Heavens, no," said Nicole, somewhat haltingly. "No one bothers anything in here for the reason I told you." It's haunted. Chris couldn't believe his ears. Just as casually as this girl would say, "Good morning," she had said this room was haunted, and she hadn't even batted an eye. Chris stood watching the door swing open as if propelled by some unseen force. Nicole had been right when she said this place was dirty and dusty. High background scenery propped in a disorderly fashion dominated the room. Some of the backdrops were covered with something like cheesecloth, but age and dust had given everything a dingy hue. Spidery cobwebs hung in the corners. All of a sudden, Chris remembered his manners and stepped back to let Nicole go in first. "Thank you," she said, "but I don't care to go in. All that dust will flare up my allergy. You and Mike can go in if you like." After a fleeting moment, Chris thought he detected the faint trace of a smile on this hoity-toity girl. Did she think he was... "Come on, Mike," he said. "Let's take a look." "Chris," Mike finally spoke as they moved slowly into the crowded room, "I've been trying to tell you the man who beat that Mr. Flynn with the fire dog was the father of John Wilkes Booth, the man who assassinated Abraham Lincoln." Without knowing why, Chris lowered his voice before he spoke. "Don't tell me you believe that hogwash about this room being haunted." "I didn't say I believed it," said Mike defensively, "but I'm telling you he was a real person because I've read about him." Yeah, Mike, I know. You've read everything. Just everything." Chris was avidly taking in the room and really not putting much thought into what he said to his brother. "No, Chris," Mike spoke in his serious way, "I haven't read everything, not nearly everything." "Oh, for crying out loud, Mike." Chris winced as he bumped his knee with a bang against one of the old trunks in his path. "Let's get out of here." But even in his impatience with Nicole and Mike, Chris knew that he had not seen the last of this room. In his quick look about, he caught sight of many interesting things: wooden kegs, oddly shaped trunks, antique guns, pirates' costumes and cutlasses, those are knives, are guns, and many, many more enticing-looking objects. At any rate, he thought, as they closed the creaky old door and started down the hallway, things were looking up. It might not be such a boring 2 weeks after all. The first chance he'd get, he'd shake this Nicole and Mike and find out what this room really held. And the nicest part of it was the prop room wasn't far from where Nicole said their apartment would be. "Mom probably wanted us to help unpack," said Mike, breaking into Chris's reverie. The three of them headed toward the upstairs landing and the Kramers' lavish rooms.